The air in the American colonies was thick with tension, a palpable unease that had been building for over a decade. The colonists, once loyal subjects of the British Crown, felt their bond fraying due to a series of parliamentary acts that seemed intent on nothing less than draining them of their hard-earned prosperity. The cries of taxation without representation echoed across the land, a deeply held conviction that they should not be forced to pay for a distant war when they had no voice in Parliament. The seeds of discontent had been sown, watered by the ever-present fear of losing the liberties that had drawn them to these shores in the first place, and now it seemed the harvest of rebellion was at hand. Then came the night of December 16, 1773, when a band of men disguised as Mohawk Indians snuck aboard British ships in the Boston harbor and dumped valuable cargo, tea, into the icy water. This dramatic act of defiance, known as the Boston Tea Party, was a direct response to the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade in the colonies. It was a blow struck not only against the company, but against the very principles of taxation without representation. The reaction from Britain was swift and severe. The Port Act closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, essentially punishing the entire city until the colony's leaders gave in. It was a dangerous game, one that pushed the colonies closer to the brink. But then came the powder. It started in 1774, when news spread like wildfire through the colonies about the arrival of British troops in Massachusetts. The people of Boston saw it as a direct assault on their liberties and responded by forming a committee of correspondence to communicate with other colonies, urging them to take action. Their rallying cry was simple, yet powerful: no taxation without representation. Tensions continued to rise throughout 1774 as news of the coercive acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, reached the colonies. These acts were designed to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party, but only served to unite the colonies against British rule. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, marking a significant step towards unity among the colonies. It was here that colonial leaders from 12 colonies met to discuss a unified response to the growing crisis. They adopted a resolution that condemned the coercive acts and asserted the right of the colonies to self-governance. The Congress also agreed to meet again in May 1775, and if peaceful resolutions failed, to take up arms against British tyranny. The first spark of war finally ignited on April 19, 1775, in Lexington, a small town north of Boston. British Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith led a force of 700 redcoats on a mission to seize colonial weapons and ammunition stored in At Lexington, he encountered a small company of around 75 Minutemen, local militiamen, who were prepared to fight. As the British troops approached Lexington, the order was given: stand your ground. When shots were fired, it's unclear who fired first, but what followed was a deadly volley that left 8 Americans dead or wounded. The redcoats then continued their march to Concord. However, word of the skirmish in Lexington spread quickly, and by the time the British reached Concord, thousands of colonial militia had gathered. Realizing their vulnerability, the British retreated to Boston, covering their retreat with cannon fire. The Americans pursued them, harassing the redcoats all the way. This first battle was a clear victory for the Patriots, establishing them as a force to be reckoned with. The news of the battles of Lexington and Concord sent shockwaves that echoed far beyond the shores of New England. It galvanized the colonies, uniting them in a common cause against British oppression. In the aftermath of those fateful confrontations, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia to chart the course of the burgeoning American Revolution. As delegates from 13 colonies assembled, the gravity of the situation was clear. They were on the brink of a full-blown war with the most powerful empire on earth. Among the most vital tasks before them was the establishment of a unified military force, a continental army that could stand toe-to-toe with the might of the British Empire. This monumental decision was entrusted to the capable leadership of General George Washington, a man whose name would soon become synonymous with the American Revolution. Under his banner, a ragtag assembly of colonial militiamen and volunteers began to form an army. Though green and lacking in supplies, their resolve was as strong as the Liberty Bell that tolled in Independence Hall. The odds were stacked against them, but their cause was just, and their spirit was unbroken. As the war for independence intensified, the need for a formal break with the Crown became more urgent. By 1776, The relationship between the colonies and Britain had deteriorated to such an extent that reconciliation seemed like a distant memory. King George III, steadfast in his belief that the colonies were his to rule over, showed no inclination to compromise. As the conflict escalated, the cry for independence grew louder. The Second Continental Congress, reflecting the sentiment of the people, took a bold step. They appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration that would articulate the reasons for the colonies' separation from Britain. The task fell upon one of their own, a young delegate from Virginia named Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, with his eloquent prose and ardent belief in the ideals of liberty, was the perfect choice for this momentous task. He penned a document that would become the cornerstone of American identity, the Declaration of Independence. On June 28, 1776, the Continental Congress voted to approve the declaration. It was a resounding statement of intent, a declaration to the world that the American colonies were indeed separating from the British Empire. In its most famous lines, the document proclaimed that all men are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This revolutionary concept of individual rights became the bedrock of American democracy. With the signing of the Declaration, the American colonies ceased to exist. In their place stood the United States of America, a newly independent nation ready to face the challenges ahead. The war for independence had been brewing for years, but it was in 1776 that it truly ignited. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the armed struggle, while the Declaration of Independence gave it a philosophical and political foundation. From this point forward, the Americans, though outnumbered and outgunned, were fighting for a cause that resonated far beyond their own borders, the echoes of life. Liberty and the pursuit of happiness would inspire generations to come in their own struggles for freedom and self-determination. And as the story of the American Revolution continues to unfold, so too does the legend of General George Washington. Shouldered with the immense responsibility of leading the Continental Army, Washington's leadership was tested time and again. Despite the odds stacked against him, he displayed a remarkable combination of strategic brilliance and sheer determination. His leadership inspired his troops through the darkest hours, and his name became a symbol of hope for the nascent nation. As the war dragged on, Washington and his troops endured unimaginable hardships, from freezing winters to dwindling supplies. Yet they persevered, their spirits unbroken. Battles like Trenton and Princeton early in 1777 demonstrated that the Continental Army was more than capable of standing its ground against the British. These victories provided a much-needed boost to flag and morale and showed that the Americans could win. However, it was at Saratoga in the fall of 1777 that the tide of the war truly began to turn. The American victory at Saratoga was a turning point in the war, demonstrating that the Continental Army was capable of defeating the British in a major engagement. This victory convinced France to enter the war as an American ally, providing much-needed military and financial support. With the alliance secured, the stage was set for the final act of the American Revolution. The war would be long and arduous, marked by moments of triumph and defeat. But with each passing year, the resolve of the Americans only grew stronger. The contributions of figures like Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and James Madison in securing foreign aid and support cannot be overstated. Their diplomatic efforts played a crucial role in garnering the international support that ultimately led to American victory. In the end, it was at Yorktown in 1781 that the British forces surrendered, marking the end of the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized the independence of the United States, setting the stage for a new nation to emerge on the world stage. The path to independence was paved with the blood, sweat, and tears of countless individuals, the sacrifices of the soldiers. The strategists and the everyday citizens who dared to dream of a free America laid the foundation for the nation that would become a beacon of democracy and opportunity for generations to come. This is the story of America's fight for independence, and we're about to begin Part 2, The Crucible of War, 1776 to 1777. But before we do that, if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. The months following the Declaration of Independence were a grim reality check for the Continental Army. The glorious spirit of defiance that had swept the colonies like a wildfire gave way to the brutal hardships of war. George Washington's forces, Those brave souls who answered the call of freedom were outmatched and outmaneuvered at every turn. Summer of 1776 saw the British landing a massive force in New York, under the command of General William Howe. They systematically drove Washington's army from Brooklyn, across Manhattan, and into a desperate retreat through New Jersey. It was a retreat that became synonymous with utter defeat. The losses were staggering. The morale of the troops plummeted, and it seemed as though the American cause was doomed before it had even truly begun. Washington's army, once brimming with the vigor of patriotism, now dwindled with each passing day. Enlistments expired and soldiers deserted, disheartened by the string of defeats. The British, oozing confidence, settled into winter quarters, convinced that they had already broken the back of the rebellion. But Washington, despite the profound setbacks, was not a man to give in to despair. Through the long nights of December, while the rest of the country celebrated Christmas, he planned to come back. A comeback that would rewrite the course of history. Christmas 1776 arrived with a fury, a blizzard raging across the icy landscape of New Jersey. But as the winds howled and snow swirled, an unlikely drama was unfolding. At a modest farmhouse, a group of men huddled around a table, poring over maps and sharing hushed words. It was here that General George Washington, his face etched with determination, revealed his audacious plan. The mission was perilous, the outcome uncertain, but the need for victory was dire. Washington's troops were demoralized and supplies were dwindling. A win was not merely desirable. It was essential for the survival of the rebellion. The target of this daring plan was a garrison of Hessian's German soldiers hired by the British for their renowned military prowess. These mercenaries, stationed in Trenton, New Jersey, represented a golden opportunity. If successful, this strike would inject new life into the faltering revolution, proving that Washington's army was far from defeated. But the path to victory was fraught with danger. How could they possibly pull off such an attack? The answer lay in secrecy and speed. The men must cross the ice-jammed Delaware River in the dead of night, a river swollen by winter rains and thick with floating masses of ice. They had to cross this barrier, not in boats, but on foot. It was a Herculean task. For the soldiers, the freezing water, waist-deep and filled with jagged ice chunks, became a baptism of courage. Many lost their muskets to the biting cold, making each step a gamble against hypothermia. Yet they pressed on, driven by duty and the promise of a better day. On the other side, a 9-mile march through a driving sleet and snowstorm awaited them. The wind, biting like a whip, threatened to freeze the very marrow in their bones. But their commander, George Washington, was undeterred. He knew that this was not just a battle, it was a test of wills, a fight to restore not just military glory, but the very soul of a nation. As the first rays of dawn touched the sky, they reached their destination. The Hessian garrison, nestled in its winter quarters, was blissfully unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. At precisely 8 o'clock, as the frozen air hung heavy with anticipation, the American troops made their move. The battle that ensued was swift and decisive. Outnumbered and caught off guard, the Hessians had no answer to the ferocity of the Americans. What followed was one of the most lopsided victories of the Revolutionary War, a triumph that yielded no American combat deaths. Trenton had dealt a fatal blow to British morale and injected new vigor into the faltering revolution. The echoes of this victory reverberated across the colonies, rekindling the dying embers of hope. News of the victory spread like wildfire through the colonial grapevine. At first, it was met with disbelief, too audacious to be true. Then came the confirmation, carried by breathless couriers, who raced through the winter roads. And as the reality of the victory sank in, the colonies erupted in jubilation. From Boston to Philadelphia, bonfires blazed, bells tolled, and the air was filled with the sound of celebration. The victory at Trenton wasn't just a military triumph. It was a testament to the indomitable spirit of freedom. But the triumph at Trenton was not the end, merely a beginning. For the War of Independence was a long and winding road, and the path ahead remained uncertain. Yet the victory served as a beacon, guiding the steps of a nation determined to forge its own destiny. And so, emboldened by their success at Trenton, Washington's forces set their sights on a new challenge. Just a few days later, the British garrison at Princeton awoke to the sounds of battle. Once again, the element of surprise was complete. Under cover of darkness, Washington's troops moved into position. and as the sun began to rise, the American assault was launched. The British, caught off guard, were in disarray. The battle was swift and decisive, and soon the Americans had claimed another resounding victory. With these two battles, Washington's reputation as a military leader was secured. He had shown that despite heavy losses and dwindling support, he could strategize and deliver. The psychological impact on the colonists was immeasurable. People who had despaired of the war's outcome now saw glimmers of hope. The victories at Trenton and Princeton sparked a surge of enlistment. Men who had previously shied away from the battlefield were now eager to join the fray. Suddenly, the ranks of the Continental Army were swelling once more. It was as if a switch had been flipped, transforming despondency into determination. But this resurgence of support was short-lived. As 1777 unfolded, the war continued with a series of bloody and often frustrating engagements. The campaign in the Middle Department, a region encompassing present-day Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, proved to be particularly grueling. Washington's army, though bolstered by new recruits, was still plagued by logistical nightmares. Supply lines were stretched thin, and obtaining food and ammunition became a constant struggle. The situation was further aggravated by internal squabbles between rival factions within the colonies. As the war raged on, the path to independence became clearer, but the journey was far from easy. One crucial piece of the puzzle was the campaign in the Northern Department, primarily fought in present-day New York State. Here, the British under the command of General John Burgoyne planned a sweeping advance southward from Canada. Their objective, Albany, New York, seen as the key to controlling the entire region. But what the British didn't know was that they were walking into a trap. American forces under the leadership of General Horatio Gates were lying in wait. The ensuing battles of Saratoga were a clash of ideologies, a battle to determine whether a fledgling colonial army could stand toe-to-toe with the might of the British Empire. It was a battle that would change the course of the war. By late October 1781, the British had found themselves completely surrounded in Yorktown. Outnumbered and facing almost certain capture, British leaders decided that the only option left was to attempt a nighttime escape. The plan involved a daring run to the nearby coastline where a small British fleet awaited them. If all went well, they could sail to safety in New York. However, fate had other plans. A sudden storm struck, destroying many of the boats that were supposed to help them escape. Only 2 ships managed to reach Yorktown, and those were immediately captured by the Americans. Faced with capture or the possibility of a lengthy siege, British leaders had no choice but to surrender. On October 19, 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis surrendered his entire army to American General George Washington at the village of Yorktown, Virginia. This marked the effective end of the American Revolutionary War. Word of the British surrenders spread like wildfire throughout the colonies. People rushed to the streets, waving flags and cheering. Celebrations lasted for days, with bonfires, fireworks, and parties. Even people who had remained neutral or even supported the British cause began to feel a sense of overwhelming relief that the war was over. As news of Yorktown reached Europe, celebrations erupted in France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The French government, still smarting from their defeat in the recent 7 Years' War against Britain, saw the American victory as a chance for revenge. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette hosted a grand reception in Paris, honoring American diplomats and celebrating the apparent downfall of their longtime rival, Great Britain. Across the continent, there were parades, fireworks, and public readings of the Declaration of American Independence. The mood in Britain was, of course, much different. News of the surrender caused anger, disbelief, and despair. Many British citizens felt betrayed by their government, which had denied the reality of the situation and refused to accept the independence of their American colonies. Some saw the surrender at Yorktown as a shameful national embarrassment, while others began to question the wisdom of the war effort altogether. Political cartoons depicting King George III in a negative light flooded the streets of London. People argued passionately in taverns and coffee houses about the war and its implications for the future of the empire. Despite the controversy, however, most British people accepted the inevitable. They knew that the American colonies were lost to them forever. With the war essentially over, American and British leaders began to meet in an attempt to hammer out the details of a peace treaty. The Treaty of Paris was finally signed on September 3, 1783, officially ending the Revolutionary War and recognizing the independence of the United States. By all accounts, the treaty was extremely favorable to the newly formed nation. The United States had not only won its freedom, but had also gained vast amounts of territory in the process. The country now stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, encompassing what is today the states of Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a large portion of Minnesota. In addition to this, the U.S. gained control of territories north of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi, as well as Florida from Spain and a number of Atlantic islands. Moreover, the United States had established itself as a major player on the world stage. No longer a small, isolated colony, the U.S. now had diplomatic relations with many of the most powerful nations in Europe, including France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The war had also left the American economy in a surprisingly strong position. While other nations had incurred massive debts fighting the war, the United States had actually received more money than it had spent. The war had stimulated industrial and agricultural production and opened up new economic opportunities, both domestically and internationally. Finally, the war had resulted in the creation of a new national identity. The shared experience of fighting and winning a war against a powerful empire had forged a sense of unity and patriotism among the American people. They were no longer just a collection of individuals from different colonies with different interests. They were now Americans, bound together by a common history and a common future. In short, the American victory at Yorktown had profound consequences, not only for the future of the United States, but for the entire world. It marked the end of colonial rule in North America and the rise of a new nation based on the ideals of liberty, democracy, and self-government. It inspired revolutions around the world and helped to usher in a new era of global politics. But perhaps, most importantly, it showed that even the most powerful empires are not invincible, and that even the most oppressed people can fight for their freedom and win. The aftermath of the American Revolution was a period of significant change and upheaval not only for the United States, but also for the rest of the world. The war had been a global conflict involving not only the American colonies in Great Britain, but also France, Spain, and the Netherlands. And the peace treaty that ended the war in 1783 had far-reaching implications for all of the nations involved. For the United States, the victory at Yorktown and the subsequent peace treaty brought about profound changes. Firstly, the U.S. was recognized as a sovereign and independent nation by the other major powers of Europe. This meant that the U.S. was no longer subject to the rule of the British Empire and was free to govern itself according to the principles of democracy and so. Secondly, the treaty granted the U.S. vast amounts of territory, including lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, which opened up new opportunities for expansion and economic development. Additionally, the war had a significant impact on the economy of the United States. Although the war had been expensive and had caused some economic hardship, the victory at Yorktown and the establishment of the U.S. as an independent nation led to a period of economic growth and prosperity. The U.S. was now free to develop its own economic policies and to engage in trade with other nations without interference from Britain. Furthermore, the war had a profound impact on the political landscape of the United States. The victory at Yorktown and the subsequent peace treaty established a new system of government based on the principles of democracy, federalism, and separation of powers. The United States became a model for other nations around the world that were seeking to overthrow oppressive regimes and establish their own systems of self-government. However, it is important to note that the American Revolution and its aftermath did not only affect the United States. The war had been part of a broader global conflict that involved several European powers. When the news of the American victory at Yorktown reached Europe, it caused a political earthquake. The European powers had been closely watching the conflict in America, and the outcome of the war had major implications for their own interests. France, Spain, and the Netherlands had fought alongside the Americans because they saw an opportunity to weaken their longtime rival, Great Britain. The victory at Yorktown and the subsequent peace treaty achieved that goal. Britain had been weakened as a global power and its empire had been significantly reduced. This had major implications for the balance of power in Europe and the rest of the world. In addition, the American victory at Yorktown inspired other nations around the world that were also seeking to overthrow oppressive regimes and establish their own systems of self-government. The French Revolution, which began just a few years later in 1789, was directly inspired by the American example. The ideas of democracy, liberty, and self-determination had spread across the Atlantic and had sparked a similar desire for change in France and other European countries. Overall, the American victory at Yorktown and the subsequent peace treaty had profound implications not only for the United States, but also for the rest of the world. It marked the end of colonial rule in North America and the beginning of a new era of global politics, characterized by the rise of democratic republics and the decline of monarchical empires. The legacy of the American Revolution continues to be felt today as the principles of democracy, liberty, and self-government continue to inspire people around the world to fight for their freedom and shape their own destinies. In the annals of history, few chapters are as captivating as the story of the American Revolution, and among its most pivotal moments, the Siege of Yorktown stands as a beacon of strategic brilliance and indomitable spirit. This siege marked the twilight of the conflict between Great Britain and her 13 American colonies, a struggle that would forever alter the course of world history. But what if I told you there was more to this historic event than meets the eye? What if I hinted at a secret weapon that tipped the balance of power and led to the downfall of the mighty British forces? Join me on this journey back in time as we unravel the enigma of the American Revolution and uncover the secrets that sealed the fate of Yorktown. Part 4. The final act in A New Dawn, 1781-1783. The stage was set for the final, decisive confrontation of the war. The Siege of Yorktown began on September 28, 1781. The Allied French and American forces, numbering around 17,000 men, meticulously dug siege trenches, moving closer and closer to the British defenses. The bombardment of the British position was relentless. Day and night, cannonballs and shells rained down on Cornwallis's trapped army, shattering their morale and destroying their fortifications. The British position was hopeless. With no hope of rescue by sea and facing an overwhelming force on land, Cornwallis's options dwindled to nothing. The end came swiftly. On October 17, 1781, a lone British officer, holding a white flag, appeared on a parapet. He was blindfolded and led to the American and French lines. He carried a message from Cornwallis. The British were ready to surrender. The formal surrender ceremony took place 2 days later on October 19th. As the British Army marched out, their regimental flags cased and their band playing the tune, the world turned upside down. The scene was a mix of quiet solemnity and triumphant celebration. Cornwallis, feigning illness, sent his second-in-command to present his sword to General Washington. The gesture was a final, bitter humiliation. But Washington, ever the man of dignity, had his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. Except the surrender. Yorktown was the final, devastating blow to the British war effort. News of the surrender reached London weeks later and was met with a stunned silence. King George III, a stubborn and prideful man, refused to accept the defeat. But the British Parliament, weary of the immense costs in blood and treasure, voted to end the war. The surrender at Yorktown marked the de facto end of the fighting, but it would take nearly 2 more years for a formal peace treaty to be negotiated. In Paris, American diplomats, led by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, skillfully negotiated the terms of a new world order. The negotiations were complex and delicate, with Franklin's diplomatic charm, Adams's blunt honesty, and Jay's shrewdness all playing a part. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783, and its terms were a stunning triumph for the young United States. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States and granted the new nation vast territories, from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Mississippi River. The terms were far more generous than the Americans had ever dared to hope for. The war had been won. The impossible dream had become a reality. The story of the American Revolution was a story of sacrifice, perseverance, and a firm belief in the ideals of liberty and self-governance. The soldiers, sailors, and civilians who had endured so much could now return to their homes, knowing they had fought not just for a piece of land, but for an idea that would change the world forever. The victory was a testament to the power of a people united by a common cause. But beyond the military tactics and political maneuvers, there existed a secret weapon that played a pivotal role in securing victory. Prepare to be amazed as we reveal the true mastermind behind the siege of Yorktown. and explore the lesser-known factors that shaped the outcome of this historic event. The entry of France into the American Revolution was a pivotal moment that significantly altered the trajectory of the war. Prior to France's involvement, the 13 colonies were largely on their own in their struggle for independence from Great Britain. While they had some success against the mighty British Empire, the odds were heavily stacked against them. However, with the support of France, the balance of power shifted dramatically. France's decision to enter the war was driven by several key factors. Firstly, France had long been resentful of British dominance in North America, and saw an opportunity to weaken their rival. Moreover, France had an interest in undermining British global power to prevent the British from becoming too dominant. By aiding the Americans, France hoped to reassert its own position as a major world power. Furthermore, the French public opinion was favorable towards the American cause, as many French intellectuals and the general populace admired the ideals of liberty and democracy espoused by the American revolutionaries. With French assistance, the Americans gained access to much-needed resources such as financial aid, military supplies, and most importantly, a navy. The French Navy's presence was crucial in preventing British reinforcements and supplies from reaching the colonies. Additionally, French military officers and troops joined the fight, bolstering the ranks of the Continental Army. One of the most significant contributions of France was the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The Franco-American alliance proved instrumental in trapping British General Charles Cornwallis' army and ultimately forcing their surrender. This resounding victory was a turning point in the war and effectively set the stage for the eventual independence of the United States. Overall, the entry of France into the American Revolution proved to be a game-changing event that tipped the balance of power in favor of the colonies and paved the way for their ultimate victory. Without French support, it is likely that the outcome of the war would have been very different. While the role of France in securing American independence is widely acknowledged, it is essential to recognize the contributions of other European powers that also provided crucial support during this pivotal moment in history. Spain, another European nation with interests in the outcome of the war, actively participated in the conflict. Spain's involvement aimed to challenge British dominance in North America and the Caribbean, and to recapture territories previously lost to the British. Spain's alliance with France enabled them to divert British forces away from the American front, further weakening the British war effort. Additionally, Spain provided financial aid and military supplies to the American colonies, contributing to their ability to sustain the fight for independence. Perhaps most notably, Spain played a significant role in the capture of the city of Pensacola in 1781, which was an important strategic victory for the Spanish and their allies. These efforts demonstrated that the struggle for American independence was not solely reliant on France or any single nation, and that a collective effort from various European powers was instrumental in achieving victory. Therefore, while France's contributions were monumental, it is crucial to recognize the multifaceted nature of the alliances and the combined efforts of European nations that made American independence a reality. As the American Revolution reached its climax, a sense of urgency gripped the hearts of both the British and American forces. With the fate of an empire hanging in the balance, each side raced against time to secure victory. For the British, it was a desperate attempt to salvage their reputation and maintain their global supremacy. They had already invested immense resources and prestige in the endeavor, and the thought of losing was unbearable. On the other hand, the Americans, with their ideals of liberty and self-determination, were eager to claim their hard-earned freedom and establish a new nation based on principles of democracy. They had endured years of hardship and sacrifice, and the prospect of independence filled them with hope for a brighter future. This sense of urgency manifested itself in the strategies and actions of both sides. The British, under pressure to succeed, adopted a more aggressive approach, launching a series of decisive offensives to crush the rebellion once and for all. Meanwhile, the Americans, driven by their desire for freedom, fought with tenacity and determination, leveraging their knowledge of the terrain and support from their European allies. The clock was ticking, and both sides knew that the outcome of the conflict would have far-reaching consequences for their respective nations and the course of history itself. As the battle lines were drawn and the drums of war echoed across the land, the question hung heavy in the air. Would the British prevail and crush the rebellion? Or would the Americans triumph and secure their birth as a free and independent nation? Only time would tell. In the tapestry of history, few figures loom as large as George Washington, the man who led the Continental Army through the arduous years of the American Revolution. Under his steadfast leadership, a ragtag group of colonists transformed into a formidable force that defied the might of the British Empire. Yet what truly set George Washington apart was not just his military prowess, but his ability to inspire unwavering loyalty and camaraderie among his troops. Washington understood the importance of cultivating a sense of unity and purpose within his army. He recognized that the soldiers who answered the call to arms were not merely fighting for a king or an empire, but for the very soul of their fledgling nation. With the odds stacked against them, Washington's leadership was instrumental in shaping the Continental Army into a cohesive and resilient force. He emphasized the shared ideals of liberty and self-governance, reminding his troops that they were not just soldiers, but pioneers of a new way of life. Through his personal example and unwavering commitment to the cause, Washington inspired his troops to push through the darkest hours of despair and emerge victorious on the battlefields of Yorktown. His leadership transcended the boundaries of rank and position, fostering a sense of brotherhood and camaraderie that became the cornerstone of the American Revolution. Washington's ability to unite his troops was not merely a tactical maneuver, but a testament to his profound understanding of human nature and the power of shared purpose. In doing so, he forged a bond that would withstand the test of time and ensure that the legacy of the American Revolution would live on for generations to come. And as the final curtain call approached, the presence of these individuals only served to underscore the magnitude of the event and the stakes involved in its outcome. The eyes of the world were upon Yorktown as the drama unfolded before them. It was a moment pregnant with possibilities, a culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. As the echoes of the final surrender reverberated through the historic streets of Yorktown, it marked not just the end of a war, but the dawn of a new era. The American Revolution had triumphed, giving birth to a nation that would stand as a beacon of liberty and self-governance for the world. But beyond the celebratory fervor, there was a sobering realization that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. The newly independent United States would have to navigate the complexities of nation building, forging a government that balanced individual rights with the common good, all while striving to uphold the ideals that had inspired its birth. Yet despite the uncertainties that lay ahead, the spirit of Yorktown burned brightly, a testament to the indomitable spirit of those who dared to dream of a better world. It was a reminder that when ordinary people stood united by a common cause, they could indeed become the architects of their own destiny. As the sun set over Yorktown, casting long shadows over the battlefield where freedom had been forged, the world held its breath. For in this moment of transition, the fate of an entire nation hung in the balance. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. We've explored the epic events of the Siege of Yorktown, the strategic brilliance, the daring maneuvers, and the indomitable spirit that shaped this pivotal moment in history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more captivating historical tales. Together, let's keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep unraveling the mysteries of our past. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning. The year is 1783, and America has won her independence from Britain. This is a moment you've been waiting years for. You fought long and hard for this moment, and now you can finally exhale. You defeated the most powerful empire on earth, all while creating a nation based on the ideals of freedom, democracy, and equality. The future is wide open. The potential for your newly independent nation seems limitless. It must feel good to finally be free, right? Well, actually, no. See, winning the war was on the end of the story because it turns out the war was only half of it. Now, the real work begins. Turns out governing a nation is harder than fighting one. As the euphoria of victory wore off, the newly independent United States was left in sharp financial decline. Its territory was vast, its population dispersed, and the central government was weak. So much for the American dream. And now we have to turn our story over to the great George Washington himself, the man who led the Continental Army to victory. And I'm guessing you probably already know how this goes. He went on to become the first president of the United States and all that jazz. But things weren't so simple. Not at all. Let's get into it. Alright, let's recap real quick. At the end of part 4, I told you about the British surrender at Yorktown, and how that led directly to the Treaty of Paris in 1783. That treaty officially ended the Revolutionary War and recognized the United States as a sovereign nation, free and independent from the rule of King George III. Now, you might think that would be cause for celebration, and it was, but there was a bit of a problem. The problem was that while the fighting was over, the war had left the United States in sharp financial decline. For one thing, war is expensive. It costs a lot of money to outfit soldiers, to feed them, to pay them, and especially to keep them supplied with rum, which, turns out makes up a surprisingly significant part of military spending. With debts mounting, the U.S. Congress struggled to manage the nation's finances. Foreign powers expected repayment for loans they made during the war, and the United States had nothing to show for except a pile of IOU. The value of currency was unstable, trade was disrupted, and the economy was in chaos. Oh, and just to add insult to injury, most of the southern colonies had lost approximately 2/3 of their wealth during the war. In short, the road to independence was paved with good intentions, but it turned out the journey to a stable economy would be a lot bumpier. Okay, so how does the United States get herself out of this mess? Well, believe it or not, it all comes down to the Articles of Confederation. More specifically, it comes down to the flaws in the Articles of Confederation. If you recall from part 2 of this series, the Articles of Confederation was the first Constitution of the United States. It was adopted in 1777, and it established a central government that consisted of a single branch, the legislative branch, which represented the states. Each state got one vote in the National Congress regardless of population, which meant that big states like Virginia and New York had the same amount of power as tiny states like New Hampshire or Connecticut. And those states were very wary of giving any other branch of government too much power, for fear that it would become a tyrannical government, and they used every tool at their disposal to ensure that didn't happen. But beyond that, the Articles of Confederation prohibited the central government from doing pretty much everything. The central government couldn't levy taxes. It couldn't regulate commerce. It couldn't establish a national currency. Couldn't raise an army. And the central government did need an army because under the Articles of Confederation, it was the responsibility of the states to provide troops for the central government. Imagine trying to run a modern country with the equivalent of a neighborhood watch for a military. Also, the Articles of Confederation required unanimous consent from all 13 states for any amendment to be made to it, meaning without unanimous consent, the Articles of Confederation couldn't be changed, ever. And if you think getting 13 colonies to agree on anything was hard during the American Revolution, try getting 13 independent states to do anything at all. Needless to say, the central government under the Articles of Confederation was weak, too weak to resolve internal disputes, much less handle external threats. The result was a country that was on the verge of collapsing before it even really began. So here's where George Washington comes in. By 1786, it became clear to many, many people that the United States needed a new constitution, a new plan of government. And in 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention to discuss what that might look like. Rhode Island was the only state not to attend, likely because Rhode Island had a lot to lose under a new constitution. Slavery was still legal in the South, and the framers knew that the southern states would never agree to abolish slavery unless they were compensated for the loss of their property. To get around this, the framers agreed to allow states to continue practicing slavery until 1808, which was a huge mistake. Anyway, I digress. What happens in Philadelphia is a secret. Nobody is allowed to talk about what goes on inside those walls. The meeting is shrouded in secrecy, and anyone who talks about it will be put to death. That's how serious this is. It was during this convention that the United States decided to abandon the Articles of Confederation and replace it with something new, something better. And what emerged from that convention was the United States Constitution. It established a federal system of government with 3 separate branches. The first branch was the legislative branch, which would make laws. The second branch was the executive branch, which would enforce laws. And the third branch was the judicial branch, which would interpret laws. This new plan of government separated powers between the central government and the state governments, and it established a system of checks and balances between the three branches of the federal government, and it set up a process for amending the Constitution, although it did require a supermajority to do so. In other words, the United States went from this to this in a matter of a few months. It was quite the improvement. But the Constitution wasn't perfect. Far from it. There was still a lot of debate over the balance of power between the federal government and the state governments. And the issue of slavery was still unresolved. In fact, some argue that it was actually resolved incorrectly. But we'll save that argument for another time. The point is, there's still a lot of kinks left to be worked out. So the framers took a break from writing a new constitution to write a list of 10 amendments, which outlined basic rights that the federal government couldn't infringe upon. These are what we call the Bill of Rights. Together, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights formed the basis of the new government of the United States. The United States was officially a constitutional republic, which means that the country was governed by laws that were created by elected representatives who were accountable to the people. It was a radical concept, one that the world had never seen before. When the Constitution was presented to the states for approval, however, many were opposed to it. They feared that the central government was becoming too powerful, and that it would trample on the rights of the states, or even the people themselves. Anti-federalists, like the great Thomas Jefferson, argued that the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights to protect individual liberties. Federalists, like the great Alexander Hamilton, argued that such a list of rights was unnecessary and even dangerous. They feared that if the Constitution was amended to include a Bill of Rights, it might inadvertently suggest that other rights not listed in the Bill of Rights might be infringed upon. In the end, the Federalists won. The Constitution was ratified in 1788, and George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. Now, before we wrap up, I want to say that I know this stuff can get a little complicated, but it's important to understand why the Constitution is the way it is. A lot of the arguments that were being made in 1787 are still being made today. And understanding what our founders were thinking can help us to navigate these debates in a more informed way. Anyway, George Washington's 2 terms as president were a period of immense challenge and triumph. During his first term, he dealt with the threat of war with France, the uprising of the Whiskey Rebellion, and the controversies surrounding the Jay Treaty with Britain. In his second term, he faced the challenge of creating a national bank and establishing a president for presidential succession. Through it all, he demonstrated a remarkable level of patience, wisdom, and humility. Despite facing opposition from political rivals, including his own party, Washington ultimately succeeded in many of his goals, setting precedents for the presidency that would last for centuries. When he died in 1799, he left behind a legacy of public service and patriotism that continues to inspire Americans today. But his final farewell to the nation, his famous farewell address, was a powerful warning against political factions and foreign entanglements. Washington believed that political parties would only serve to divide the nation, and that foreign policy should be guided by a commitment to neutrality and peace. Unfortunately, his warnings went largely unheeded, and the United States would soon become embroiled in the first of many foreign conflicts. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. And with that, our story has come to an end. Thank you so much for watching. Your support allows me to keep making these videos, and I really appreciate it. Anyway, that's all I got. Until next time.